We'd like to hope for peace and pray for peace, and that we should, but history tells us, for all of history, that people have been fighting with one another. And the holidays actually sometimes even bring that out. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen when we get together as a family? And we'd like to unpack that a little bit this morning.
So we've come to the end of the first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount covers Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And we're coming to the end of this way that he's speaking where he says, you've heard it said. And then he'll quote a piece of the Old Testament, and then he expands on that to explain it better and to fulfill it, really. And that's what we're going to come to today. In Matthew 5:38, he says, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Isn't that a beautiful picture, right? An eye for an eye and a tooth. That's graphic, right? Come on, that is graphic violence. If this was, we were going to put a rating on this sermon today, I'm not sure what it would get. It might get an R for graphic violence. I mean, he just had told us, a week ago to cut off our hand if it offend us, and now he's pointing us back to these scriptures. And what does it mean, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? He's quoting the law, right, like he has been doing. He's quoting the law, specifically the law of Moses that was given to govern the people of Israel as they were a fledgling nation, becoming their own people, no longer slaves, but their own nation, free. And in Exodus 21, it says this, but if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Doesn't that sound fun, right? It sounds like a whole lot of hurt people. But there's something I think we don't realize because we're so used to living in the Sermon on the Mount, in a culture that understands the Sermon on the Mount, that just sounds so brutal and violent to us. But what this was actual equality and justice taking place. Because before this, the cycle was, you take my eye, I'll take your eye and your arm. Right? It escalates. It's not equal. It escalates. And then that turns into a family being vengeful against another family, and then a tribe against a tribe, and a nation against a nation, and it just spins out of control. And what God was doing is put a stop to that escalation of violence and bringing justice and equality to bear.
Leviticus, where another piece of this was taken, would tell us, anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. This is where Western nations, for the most part, find the underpinnings for capital punishment, is out of these scriptures. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Deuteronomy would say, Deuteronomy is the second telling of the law, the second rendition of the law. But if out of hate someone lies in wait and assaults and kills a neighbor and flees to another city, these cities of refuge, the killer shall be sent for by the town elders and be brought back from the city and handed over to the avenger of blood to die. Show no pity. And pretty stark, show no pity. You must purge from Israel the guilt of the shedding of innocent blood so that it may go well with you. So you hear, this nation of Israel was surrounded by all kinds of other nations. And the way it worked there was just this escalation that Jason's describing, that there was no standard of justice. It was all relative to whoever happened to have the power. And so they could exact justice in any way they saw fit. But what it did was it bred just cycles of revenge, where you'd have just national this national identity was this one of revenge. Or we see it today. We see it today among the races. We see this cycle of anger and frustration and revenge and so forth. I was just in Chicago a week and a half ago. The murder capital of our nation, 675 murders since January 1 of this year, and the year's not over yet. The majority of those were revenge killings, gang related. You killed my friend, now you shot mine, now you're going to. And so it's almost like this thing, you have to ask the question, does it ever end? And in some ways, this was God's justice, but also his mercy in trying to put parameters on human injustice and the vengeance that would follow.
So it does two things. It defines justice, and it's preventing violent, destructive cycles of personal revenge. The reason why it works is because we're selfish. And it'll still work today, and does still work when it's the basis of a justice system, because we're selfish. Because even if I don't think twice about taking your eye, if I know that taking your eye means I lose an eye, I'm definitely going to think twice about it, right? This is the system that's in place, that, if I do this, then I will suffer. Not they will suffer, I will suffer. And that's why it works. Now, sometimes law and legal gets a bad rap in Christianity. We're like, we're a grace community, man. We're all about the New Testament. We're all about grace. And trust me,
we're not about legalism.
I love Galatians, and I don't like legalism at all. But would you rather live in a society with laws or a society with no laws? Trust me, you would rather live in a society with laws. If you've ever visited a country where the rule of law is completely collapsed, or there just is no rule of law, it is chaos, and every man's life can be forfeit on a whim. Just like that. I'll take your life. It's mine. The strongest prevail and the weak suffer. And so there is a sense in which the law is very just, and you want it in place.
It's interesting what he said there. Think about it, that where you're in a culture where there's lawlessness, life is cheap. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the drastic measures you have here, it's because God saw that that life was valuable. Mm-hmm. But see, I think sometimes we want some weird sort of nirvana state where if we just all for peace, couldn't we just all get along? Can't we recognize the brotherhood of man? And I want to tell you that if you study history, the culture, the history of the world, the history of mankind, the answer to that is no, we don't, and we can't. And I think the sooner we confront that, the better off we're going to be. And I think sometimes I hear Christianity described as this interesting sort of innocent nirvana on earth, that it's just a God of love and we just all need to love one another. I agree with that, but that's only partially true, because God, first of all, was revealed as a God of justice. And I submit to you that justice, trying to understand or define or even apply grace in my life or in the lives of others without understanding justice is futile. Because if I didn't deserve justice, then why would grace be attractive to me? If I didn't believe that I was guilty before God and worthy of judgment, the soul that sins, it says in the Old Testament, shall die. Paul would carry it all the way forward into the New Testament and say, the wages of sin is death, separation from God. So my condition, the recognition of my condition before God, all of a sudden makes grace incredibly attractive. And even more than that, incredibly powerful, because God breaks the cycle that I really should have inherited or that I propagated myself.
So to show this isn't just a human origin, God himself brings justice to the people of Israel. He brings judgment to the people of Israel. Ezekiel 16 says, you will bear the consequences of your lewdness and your detestable practices, declares the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says, I will deal with you as you deserve. I will deal with you as you deserve, because you have despised my oath by breaking the covenant. What does that sound like? What do we ask for when we're asking for mercy? Say, please, God, don't deal with me as I deserve. The only reason why we can ask that, the only basis at all that we have to ask for that is because justice has been fulfilled in the cross.
Was it a year ago, a young man went into a Bible study, a white young man, into a Bible study of African Americans, and was it North Carolina?
I believe so, yeah.
And sat through the entire Bible study with them. And at the end of the Bible study, pulled out a pistol and in cold blood murdered 9 of those participants in that Bible study. His idea when he was arrested was that he was going to start a race war. Twisted human being, right? He's put in prison, and the family members of those who had lost visited that young man in prison. And with every right to be angry and to wish judgment, basically looked him in the face and said, we're not saying we're not angry. We're not saying that injustice wasn't done. But what we're saying is we forgive you because we refuse to allow hate to dominate our lives. So if we hated you, you would have won. They said it in love. They were just stating a simple fact. I will not allow hate to have the last word in this situation. So this is what you have. But the interesting thing is they didn't open the door and let that man go free. He's still behind bars today, and he probably will be for the rest of his life. So here you see on this institutional level, you see justice being done. And on this personal level, the people who had suffered the injustice saying, I will not move towards personal vengeance and retribution. I will not allow hate to destroy the rest of my life like it destroyed my mother's life.
So here we're going to unpack now what is the next piece. Jesus turns the system on its head. He says, you have heard it said this, but how is he going to fulfill this law? And he brings it about by saying, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. That's important. We'll unpack that in a minute. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you.
He lists 4 things here. 4 things that, we don't know why he picked these 4 cultural things, but they were very relevant to the culture in which he lived, in which these words were spoken. And I think they're relevant to us today. Look at the 4 things. There's insult, there's lawsuits, forced service, and there's giving. So the first one, he says, if someone slaps you on the cheek, and in that culture, in Arabic culture, Middle Eastern culture, much like other cultures of the world today that have kind of, where it's trickled down, to slap someone. Remember the old movies where the guy would pull out his fancy glove and slap him in the face? I challenge you to a duel. So it went from slapping you with my kid leather glove to, now I'm going to shoot you. Mm-hmm. Because it was the ultimate statement of insult. And the word there, slap, is like this, it's strong backhand. It's not just like a little, it's like a whap.
Yeah. I know he's going to hit me before the sermon's
one of these
over.
days. I've done this.
Third time we've done this. Every time it gets a little bit closer.
Lean in a little bit.
Uh-huh.
So it's this insult, right? This in front of everybody. I've just shamed you.
That is hard to deal with. Matter of fact, in every culture, there's this insult that's gone too far. If I let him get away with that, now I've lost status. But the next piece, lawsuits, that's kind of interesting. What is he saying? Like, if someone sues the shirt off of your back, give him your coat as well. That sounds kind of foreign to us, but they could actually sue one another for their clothes. I could sue you into nudity, almost. Mm-hmm. Almost in that culture. But the way they would stop, they'd say, okay, but you cannot take their outer garment, because then that leaves them exposed to the elements. They could literally die. And so you always couldn't, if you had nothing left, you couldn't take away someone's outer garment. And what Jesus is saying, even if they have sued and won unjustly and got what is rightfully yours, take off that thing that they can't take from you and give it to them anyway.
Forced service. These words were written in an occupied territory.
Yeah.
And none of us, almost no one in this room, I don't think, could relate to this. These words were written to a group of people who were living under Roman domination. They had done away with the nation of Israel per se. The nation of Israel was subjected to everything they wanted, to every whim. And so part of that arrangement was that a Roman soldier at any time could just grab you on the street and say, you, Jew, carry my armor, carry my stuff, carry my bags. You have to carry it for the equivalent of 1 mile. And they couldn't resist that. That was part of the occupation.
And it's being treated like an animal.
Yeah. It's a shameful thing.
You're my pack animal.
Yep. And so Jesus comes. Remember the story of Simon the Cyrene? He's forced to carry the cross of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Remember they catch him going through the street. You, Jew, carry this guy's cross. And that was a common thing to see men going through the streets with a cross on the way to the crucifixion. And Jesus says, do this. If they make you go 1 mile, you have every right to drop it and say, I did what was required of me. I've done the mile. Shock them. Say, hey, you know what? I'm going to carry this another mile if that's all right with you. What?
Mm-hmm. The last piece of giving. This is challenging, man. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You know why this is challenging? Because we spend so much time averting our eyes from need. right? And we justify lots of things. I have my own need, or these people need it more than these people, or hey, the mission told me not to give to them because I need to send them downtown, as if we're giving to the mission, right? And this challenges me all the time. You know why? Because giving sometimes feels like a bottomless pit. Like there's never going to be an end to it. I could pour my whole life into it and it still not fill up. And what I'm really worried about is, God, what about my needs? What about me? If I do that, who's going to meet my needs? And it's what it is it's not trusting God.
Isn't it interesting how many times we connect all this stuff, all four of these, we connect our response to behavior. Isn't it true? To behavior. I'm conditioned, I'm not sure where, it's probably just simple human nature, that if I'm treated right, I'm going to respond in kind. I mean, that's how we work, right? Every one of these has some application today in the world with which we live. We don't pull out gloves and slap each other on the cheek, but we flip each other off in traffic, don't we? Or we get flipped off. We get signaled. We get insulted in traffic. Well,
Are you doing that?
No. We don't do that. But we get angry, don't we?
Yeah.
Don't we? I was telling a story, just every time I'm working on stuff like this, the craziest stuff happens to me. It's like I can hear God laughing in the heavens sometimes. I was pulling in about a week ago to a grocery store, and the guy pulling out was in the lane to come in. He must have not noticed, but excuse me, you're in my lane. And so we're like this. And I looked at him like there was nowhere for me to go but to back up into traffic. But he looks at me and insults me with his hand gesture. And man, something inside of me just fired right up. Hey, you're in the wrong lane. Hey, who do you think? I remember going around him and going into the store, but I thought, man, I'm going to take my blood pressure right here because that really bugged me. You had no right to insult me, but how fast do we get fired up? Giving, Well, if that server does a good job, then I'm going to tip her. So are we giving based on because of who they are? Or are we giving because of who we are? Do I just respond in generosity because of who you are or aren't? Or am I a generous person regardless of how you're treating me? Boy, if you think, again, back to this Christianity is easy, then try this stuff. Just let this stuff work into your life. When someone forces you to do something that you don't have to do, or you don't want to do, but you make a decision, I'm going to go farther than you ever imagined because God's worthy.
Look, it's super important here to realize that Jesus is not saying to just take a passive attitude towards evil.
Oh, no.
Just let evil run its course. That is not what's being said. He's not saying don't resist evil or don't resist the devil. Just the opposite. John says, 1 John 3:8, the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's works. What he's pointing out is that the devil's works will never destroy the devil's works. Hate won't defeat hate. Anger won't defeat anger, right? The working in that same spirit is never going to defeat that spirit. It only makes it stronger. So what he's given us is more powerful, overcoming tools that win spiritual victories. Maybe we're not used to that because we're so quickly manipulated into anger and frustration and rage and vengeance. But there is a whole nother set of tools given to us at our disposal if we'll just reach into the fruit of the Spirit and realize that there's more power there than the devil has ever had. And yet we still choose his weapons over and over again.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor during World War II. He was incarcerated in the mid-40s, in the middle of the war, for speaking against the Nazi regime. He refused to back down. He refused to stop pastoring his people. And he refused to stop calling evil what it was in that political form. He's put in a concentration camp, and he spends the last few years of the war and the last few years of his life there. He writes these words from that camp. He says, evil becomes powerless when it finds no opposing object, no resistance, but instead is willingly born and suffered. Evil then meets an opponent for which it is not a match. He died. Those weren't just good poetry written in captivity. He died 2 months before the end of the war, before that camp was liberated by the Allies. And he was hung out of spite because his captors refused to let him go, even though they knew the camp would be liberated. They ended his life. They hung him. So this guy lived out these words. And sometimes this is where I'm saying that, where does this meet that rubber meet the road with us?
That's where you see Paul step in Romans and start to unpack, like, okay, so now the church is alive and well and growing, and it's even in what you might say the belly of the beast in Rome. And he's writing a letter to these Roman believers who are right there amidst this unjust, oppressive system, some of them Gentiles and some of them Jews. And what does he say? What are the weapons he gives us? He says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. Thanks, Paul. Thanks a lot. That is not what I wanted to hear. Right? I wanted to rebel. I wanted to resist. He says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoers.
See, total pacifism would do away with armies and do away with law enforcement, but that kind of world wouldn't be a loving world at all. I mean, that kind of pacifism is, there's no resistance to evil at all, and God's put us in this world according to that scripture. On an institutional level, on a government level, that there's parameters that cannot be crossed or society will crumble. But you may say, well, gosh, what about corrupt governments? What about corrupt law enforcement? Well, those behind that statement are individual people who have succumbed to the very thing we're describing here. They've come underneath this thing. They've become vengeance-minded people. They've become racists. And so Paul is just pleading, in a sense, he's describing something that's happening at two levels: an individual level, that whereas human beings, we're not overcome with evil, but then an institutional level that we submit to at the same time. So we're individuals living in a nation. We're individuals living in a society or in a culture. Listen to the way John Piper would describe this. At the personal level, we will be willing to suffer for their everlasting good, suffering for this person who opposes me, this person that hates me. And we will give them food and drink, my enemy. We will put away malicious hatred and private vengeance. But at the public level, we will also magnify the justice of God by praying and working for justice to be done on the earth, if necessary, through wise and measured force from a God-ordained authority. So you see these two levels of living, if you will, personal and national or institutional. And now Jesus is going to turn a corner here, and he's going to actually drive this a little bit home even further about, well, who's my enemy? You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. When I read that earlier in the week, I was like, wait a minute, where does it say that? Love your neighbor and hate your enemy? I realized it doesn't say that. Jesus is quoting from a partial scripture. Listen to the scripture in Leviticus 19:18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You think, well, wait a minute, what the heck happened? Well, what happened is the Jews embraced that. Jesus said for us to love our neighbor. Are you a Jew? Yes, I love you. Are you a non-Jew? I can hate you now. That's literally what they did. They took the commandment and isolated it. If you remember the story in the New Testament about the Good Samaritan, what was that story about? The story was about a bunch of religious professionals, lawyers, who said, well, now who's our neighbor? Because to them, their neighbor for their entire existence had been the Jew. And everybody outside of that was fair game to charge interest, to exact just unrighteous judgment on, to take advantage of. As long as you weren't my neighbor, then you were fair game. And Jesus says, I tell you, no, listen, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Now, there's going to be watch carefully the categories here. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun, the ball of fire out there, his sun, to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Theologians would call this common grace. That we wake up every morning, whether we acknowledge God or not, and we get to enjoy the sun or the rain. The sun that makes my skin warm and the rain that makes my flowers grow. And it doesn't matter whether I believe in the Creator or not. Jesus says, listen, we're children of the Father, and he makes them to prosper. If you only love those who love you, what reward will you get? Aren't even tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Don't even pagans do that? Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Those categories Bruce asked you to pay attention to, there's 4 of them. And the first one is the toughest. The first one is those who persecute you, right? And we're talking about serious persecution, not I think they misspelled my name on my cup at Starbucks. I had a cross on, and I think they were trying to make a statement.
Yeah.
No, man, I'm talking about serious persecution. In other words, those who openly oppose the gospel, blatant God haters. And Jesus is saying, love them and pray for them.
I think this is, I would, if I was a betting man, there isn't more than, on one hand, if that, of people in this room we've actually experienced hatred or racism or something leveled against us, not because of our skin color or our culture, but because we're followers of Jesus. And I think we've gotten in trouble because we're obnoxious followers sometimes, but just for the simple fact of followers of Jesus, I think it's a very rare thing in this nation to be persecuted. But you get outside this country in some places, and that's a very common thing. There are brothers and sisters today, the family of God, who are sitting behind prison doors only because they're followers of Jesus. And Jesus, this is why I believe he puts this one first. This is the most blatant, this is the rawest one. They hated me, Jesus said, and they're going to hate you, he told his followers. But be of good cheer. I've overcome that world. I've overcome that system. But he said, but he has a promise. If they hated me, odds are you're going to find yourself at some point hated.
The second one you can't get away from. Unless you live in a bubble, it's the evil and the unrighteous. And now this you bump up against every day. The lost, the dishonest, the rebellious, the person who just wants to shortchange you, the person who wants to cut in line, the person that escalates, past that, where it hurts an entire society. People who make choices that cost our society something. And that's something we have to deal with every day.
You might find it in the workplace. You might find somebody that they're unrighteous in the way they do the books. They're unrighteous in the way they schedule. They're unrighteous in the way they treat other people. They treat their employees. You might find it in family. They're unrighteous in the way they treat each other. There's been abuse, and it's never been brought to the light. It's never been called to account. And maybe you or I have had to suffer at the hands of that. I didn't ask for it. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, born into the wrong family, whatever. But we've suffered because of the unrighteousness, the sin of other people. And it's not our sin, but we have to clean up the mess. Someone who's walked out on us after making a commitment. What does that produce in us? And then the third one, Jesus said, anyone who doesn't love you.
People don't love me?
What?
That can't be true.
It's disappointing.
You know what that feels like? Why should I love someone who doesn't love me? Right? What's the point in that? I love the people that love me. The people that don't love me, they get whatever they give me. Right? If you hate, I'll hate. You want to be casual? I'll be casual. That's fine. But we tend to reserve love for the people that love us, to be honest.
Man, who might that be? My ex? Ouch. My grumpy neighbor? Again, a colleague at work who is just hard to live with. and they just don't like me for whatever reason. It's always a little shocking deep inside when someone just really doesn't love you, doesn't it? It's always like, what have I done to you? And of course, the last category is the most interesting to me. Anyone who is not your people.
Now he says, if you only greet your people in the marketplace. Does that sound familiar?
I'm going to only greet my race. I'm going to only greet. Let me see. Who did you vote for? Let's raise our hands. How many voted for? Oh. We can't have that on YouTube.
Because if we've got my people, then that means there's your people. And when I talk about your people, I tend to say things like those people. If those people would just, I've put them in a whole category, and I assume I know what it feels like to walk in their shoes, to live their life, and I say exactly how they ought to do it.
The opposite party, the opposite gender, women, men. The opposite denomination, just fill in the blank, whatever isn't my people. And of course, if someone asked us, we would say, I just love everybody. I'm easy to get along with. But Jesus says, here's the test. He said, I want you to pray for them. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes that might sound like, Lord, pray those people to see things correctly like I do. Pray that.
Bless their heart.
Pray that they would pay up.
Ignorant hearts.
Pray they would pay up, God. They owe me, pray they'd pay up. I just bless them today. It's like, no, it's still all about me. Mm-hmm. No, and Jesus, the context here of the prayer is pray. Remember what he said? He said pray two things. He said pray for them, and then he made the statement, remember the sunshine and rain? Sunshine and rain are the basic elements of life. And he said, your heavenly Father sends them sunshine and rain. That's the least you could do. That's the basic necessities of life. We can't live without sunshine and rain. And he says, so I want you to pray that for them. I submit to you that if you really want to see your heart begin to soften, it's impossible to remain hard towards somebody that you are sincerely praying for. I believe, first of all, I want to say we are called as a people to act redemptively towards a broken culture, a messy culture, and broken, messy people. As long as I remain angry, I am hard. My heart is hard. And so I'll pray, but I'm going to pray hard prayers like judgment, like fix them, like straighten them out. Yeah, bring it on, God. But if I'm honest, that's not the way I want to be treated. I don't pray, God, just judge me, just judge me. No, I pray, oh, God, I just claim your verses of love and mercy this morning over my life, God. It's like, oh, Lord, you just get into this. It was like, what? And Jesus said, pray for them. When you pray for somebody, that God would genuinely bless their lives. First of all, it's not easy, it's difficult. But what you find is, your heart begins to move towards what you've invested in. Mm-hmm. And prayer is time and investment. It's emotional investment. And Jesus knew a secret there. Because the option is that I react in the way I've been treated, and I become like the very thing that I'm angry towards. Isn't that right? I'll never be like my father. I will never be like that man. And then one day, about 12 or 15 years later, you say something and someone goes, man, you sound just like your dad. Like, oh.
There's something about that investment piece. Once we start to put investment in them, what happens is we see value in them. Where before we saw no value in them. They were the other, they were the wrong ones. But now because I've invested, I've put time and effort and energy. I'd even encourage giving anonymously. It's crazy talk, but I'm serious. Giving anonymously, and suddenly I see value in them that wasn't there before because I've put the value in them. I've put my time and effort in them. And it changes things on a lot of levels because prayer actually works. So it changes them, but it also changes me. And it changes how I am in their presence. When I'm around them next time, I have a completely different attitude. Why? Because I've been before the throne of God on their behalf. That's called intercession. I've been before the throne of God on their behalf, and I've got in touch with what God feels about them. Not just what I feel about them, but how God feels about them. And I'm telling you, it's impossible to hate someone when you've seen them through Jesus' eyes. It's impossible. It falls apart. All the reasons to hate them fall apart when you look through the prism of the cross.
We're going to read the last scripture here, and the worship team can come, but I want you to just listen carefully here and make sure we're tracking. I want to tell you what we're not saying. We're not saying to ignore injustice. We're not saying to ignore vengeance. We're not saying that what we should say is, well, it just doesn't matter. Well, let's just forget about it. No, because you and I know we can't forget about it. The injustice we've suffered in our lives, the pain of betrayal, the pain of abuse, that stuff cut deep. And to deny it is to really, I think, move to a place of impotence, because it just waters down your passion, and it makes you cynical. At the South Campus this morning, had just a moving thing at the end. A woman I'd never met came up and said, broken. I haven't been in church. This is the first time I've been in church in a year. I swore I was done with church. And you could just feel it. You could feel the hardness of the pain that she'd suffered somehow. And she said, I realized, though, that I was overcome. Listen to these words in Romans. Paul now, fast forwarding, still Paul writing most of these words from a prison cell. Paul living in an occupied territory by an unjust government. Paul being persecuted and punished by ungodly heathen pagan people. Paul writes, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Don't take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay. You hear what he's saying there? He's saying, no, don't ignore evil. He said, look it right in the face. Look it right in the face and be proactive now. Don't be overcome by it. You know the word, on the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you'll heap burning coals on his head. I love this last phrase, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I went and looked this word up. The word overcome is to be carried away by the beast. Evil is a beast. Evil's never going to be converted in and of itself. Evil is always going to be with us, and it's a beast. And that evil wants to steal our lives one day at a time. This lady said at South, she said, I've given up a whole year over this issue of my life, and I'm done. This beast has overcome me every morning. And he's saying, listen, no, be overcomers. Not just through personal discipline, but man, apply the cross. Man, apply the principles. What are those principles? He said, feed him, and you're going to heap burning coals of fire. It's not like, well, what does that mean?
Burning coals. People have tried to kind of brush that aside before by saying, well, that was actually a blessing. You're giving them something to start a fire with. Yeah, you don't put that on their head. There's no cultural explanation for that. Like, hey, I just want to bless you. No, what he's talking about judgment. He's just straight up talking about judgment. There's something about getting out of the way and letting God move in. And when you do that, when you actually find an enemy and you feed them when they're hungry and you give them something to drink when they're thirsty, you know what happens? They immediately go, oh, what? Now you're the good guy and I'm the bad guy? I'm the bad guy here all of a sudden? You know what's happening when that happens? They're starting to feel conviction. Before, they didn't have to feel conviction because they could just be angry at you because you were just as bad as them. But now that you're on God's plane, now that you're doing this God thing, they can't really, and it all lands on them, and something new can happen. And this crazy cycle can be broken, and love can prevail. Look, earlier Jesus said to love our enemies. Why? So that we could be children of our Father who is in heaven. I keep thinking in this last crazy season that we've been in of red versus blue versus liberal versus conservative versus Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter versus... Nothing's more dangerous than a person who has righteousness on their side. Listen, we need a paternity test. Whether you're right or wrong, are you behaving like a child of your Father in heaven? I'm not talking about right or wrong, how right you are in your stance right now. Are you behaving like a child of your Father in heaven? Or are we walking in a spirit of another father? Jesus at one time pointed a finger at the Pharisees and said, your father's the devil. Why? Because of the spirit they were walking in. And God, we do not want to walk in the spirit of the enemy, but we want to overcome evil with good.
For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? We are disciples of the one who died for his enemies. We're followers of the one who died for his enemies. And it's time for us to live like that. Jesus is throwing down the gauntlet, saying, listen, you can take I've heard people take Sermon on the Mount and make it some great ethical teaching. But Jesus is saying, no, here's how it's lived. Here's where that rubber meets the road. And as a community of believers, my heart, my prayer is that people would know, all men would know, that we're his disciples. Look how they love one another. Look how they respond to insult and injury. Look how they respond when the pressure's on. Look at how they remain soft rather than go hard. They stop making excuses and they look it full in the face. So, Father, as we finish this morning here, strip away our all of our religious self-righteousness, anything that is not of you, anything that's been man-made. We're right or righteous because of our culture or our skin or color or our denomination or our political party or our time in church, anything that is just a false sense of superiority.
God, where we've walked in the spirit of the enemy, would you show us and convict us so we can quickly repent and move back under the cross, move back into the fruit of the Spirit, back into the weapons that actually work. God, we want to be children of our Heavenly Father.
I have this picture this morning of like a room or a house, and there's a closet in the house that no one's allowed to open. It's been shut. And there's some scary things in that closet. That's why we keep a lock on it. No one else is allowed to use it. This morning, God He'd like to open that closet and face what's in there. Face the anger, face the injustice, face the racism. And He wants to do that because He'd like to give you the whole house back. He'd make the whole house clean rather than just having this unclean thing that everybody tiptoes around. I don't know if that's you this morning, but I believe that God is putting his finger on somebody and some of you that he's saying, let's deal with this thing. You don't have to do this alone. You can't do this alone. Bring it out. Put it in my hands and let's go together on this. Get behind me. I'll make the war to cease in your life, the conflict to cease. In the New Testament, you see the pattern. One thief on the cross cried out for mercy, one cursed the Lord. One centurion recognized this was the Son of God, another pierced his side with a sword. We can't control what happens around us and other people, but what God would want to do is calm us. So Father, we just yield to that this morning.